Good morning, dear students. Welcome to UDAAN Career Institute. In today's class, we will continue with chapter 2, that is reproduction in angiospermic plants. Now, students, in the last class, we have gone with development of female gametophyte, that is the embryo sac, in detail. And also, we have gone with how that development takes place into an 8 nucleated 7 cell stage of the embryo sac. In today's class, we will continue with the another topic of this chapter, that is pollination in more detail. Now, as all of you know, that what do we mean by pollination? Pollination is a process in which the male gamete it is transferred to the female reproductive part of the plant or the flower. Now, as you have learnt earlier, that male and female gametes in flowering plant they are produced in pollen grain and the embryo sac respectively. So, male gamete is present in the pollen grains and female gamete is present in the embryo sac. Now, both these type of gametes they are non-motile in nature. As a result, it should be bought together. So both male and female gamete, as they are non-motile, they should be bought together so that the fertilization can take place. Now, pollination has an ability to bring these two gametes together. So it is the mechanism to achieve this objective. So pollination is basically the transfer of pollen grains which are shed from the anther to the stigma of the pistil. This process is known as pollination. So here in this particular process the pollen grains they are transferred to the stigma of the pistil. So pistil it is the female reproductive part of the flower. So as the pollen they reach the surface of the stigma, the germination takes place and the fertilization process will start. Now flowering plants they have evolved different kind of adaptations to achieve the pollination. So pollination needs some adaptations. So these plants and these flowers they have made many kind of adaptations so that the pollination can take place. Plants also make use of external agents to achieve pollination. Now there are different kinds of pollination depending upon the source of the pollen. The pollination process it is divided into three different types. The first type of pollination is known as self-pollination. It is also known as autogamy. Now, in this type, as the name itself suggests, that pollination takes place within the same flower. So, when pollen grains from anther they are transferred to the stigma of the same flower, then this type of pollination is known as self-pollination. So, it is very simple that in this case, the pollen grains are coming from the same flower and they are falling on the stigma of the same flower. So in a normal flower which is open and it exposes the anther and the stigma, complete autogamy it is rarely seen, because whenever there is a normal flower in which both stigma and anther are open, means any other pollen from other plant or other flower can also come in contact with the stigma. As a result, there are less chances that the same flower's pollen it reaches to the surface of its own stigma. Apart from that, some another pollens would land on the stigma of this particular flower. So we can say that in normal flower, which is an open flower, autogamy, self-pollination is rarely seen because there are less chances of self-pollination to take place. In such flowers, autogamy requires synchrony in the release of pollen as well as the stigma receptivity. So if autogamy is required, then a flower should show synchrony. So a synchronous development should be there. So simultaneously there should be release of the pollen as well as simultaneously the stigma should also become receptive. So when both are growing together, when both are maturing together, in that case only autogamy can take place. And also for autogamy to take place, both anther and the stigma should lie very close to each other also. Then only the self-pollination will take place. So these are basically two conditions for an autogamy to take place in a flower. So autogamy requires synchrony, as well as for the autogamy both anther and stigma they should be close to each other. Now in some plants such as viola, oxalis and commelina, they have two different types of flowers. One type of flower they are known as chasmogamous flowers, and other type of flowers they are known as cleistogamous flowers. So same plant will produce two different types of flowers, chasmogamous and cleistogamous flowers. These chasmogamous flowers, they are similar to flowers of other species. They have exposed anthers and stigma, and they are also known as open flowers. While the cleistogamous flowers, they are closed flowers, they do not open and they do not have exposed anthers and exposed stigma. So whenever the anthers and the stigma are exposed, there are chances that cross pollination takes place because the anther is subjected to, or the pollen grains of the anther are subjected to pollinate some another flower, while the stigma it may come in contact with the pollen of another flower. Whereas in case of cleistogamous flowers, as the flower do not open at all, in such flowers the anther and the stigma they lie very close to each other, and no other pollens they are capable enough to reach the stigma of the flower. As a result, in cleistogamous flowers there will be always self-pollination which will be taking place. So autogamy it always takes place in case of cleistogamous flowers because these flowers they do not open at all. So when the anther dehiscence in the flower buds, pollen grains they will directly come in contact with the stigma and pollination will take place. As a result, cleistogamous flowers they are always autogamous and there are no chances of cross pollination to take place. Cleistogamous flowers they will produce assured seed set even in absence of pollinators. So even in absence of any kind of pollinators, pollination will still take place in case of cleistogamous flowers. Now, going towards the another part in case of pollination that is known as gytenogamy. So this is another mechanism of pollination. So what is gytenogamy? It is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of another flower but of the same plant. So here in this case the flower will be different but the plant will remain the same. That is, the pollen grains of anther of one flower comes in contact with the stigma of another flower of the same plant. So in the same plant, anther of one flower or pollen grains of one flower comes in contact with the stigma of the another flower. This process of pollination is known as gytenogamy. So functionally, if we see gytenogamy, then functionally it is cross pollination, but genetically, if we see gytenogamy, then it is self-pollination because the pollen grains are of the same plant. So gytenogamy is functionally cross-pollination involving a pollinating agent. Genetically, it is similar to autogamy, that is self-pollination, because the pollen grains they are coming from the same plant. So from genetic point of view, gytenogamy is self-pollination because all flowers of the same plant they are genetically identical. But ecologically, it is considered as cross-pollination. So gytenogamy it is seen in plants with monoecious conditions. Example, in case of cucurbita, gytenogamy takes place. Now the third mechanism of pollination is known as xenogamy. Basically, xenogamy is also known as cross-pollination. So here the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of a different plant, when this kind of condition takes place, it is known as xenogamy. And this is the only type of pollination which brings genetically different type of pollens to the stigma. So here a genetically a recombination will take place. So genetically a different pollen comes in contact with genetically different stigma, because stigma will be of the another plant. Example, it happens in case of papaya and in case of maize. Now discussing about the agents for pollination. Now basically pollination, it requires some agents, so that these agents will carry the pollen from the anther to the stigma of the flower. So basically carrying the pollens from one part to the another part requires some agents. So plant will use basically two abiotic agents, that is wind and water, and they also use one biotic agent, that is animal, to achieve the process of pollination. Now majority of the plants, they use biotic agents for pollination, that is basically animals are used as pollinating agents. Only a small proportion of plants, they use abiotic agents, that is wind and water. Now, pollen grains, they come in contact with the stigma. It is always a chance factor. Means it is not necessary that a pollen grain, when it is shed from the anther, it directly comes in the contact with the stigma. So it happens by chance in case of both wind and water pollination. As a result, to compensate for these kind of associated loss of pollen grains, the flower will produce enormous amount of pollen as compared to the number of ovules, because it is not necessary that if one pollen is shed from the anther, it will come in contact with the stigma. There are chances that it may not come in contact with the stigma also. As a result, to compensate this loss, many pollen grains are lost. Because of this reason, they may not be able to reach the surface of the stigma, and that's why large number of pollen grains are formed. So there are chances that out of large number of pollen grains, few pollens may reach to the surface of stigma. Now the first type of pollination agent, it is anemophily. It is also known as pollination by wind. Now basically pollination by wind, it is most common in case of abiotic pollination. Now wind pollination, it requires some specific characteristic in pollen grains. The pollen grains, it should be light so that they can be easily carried by wind. They should be also non-sticky, and so that they can be transported in the wind currents. Now they often possess well exposed stamens, so that the pollens, they are easily dispersed into the wind. So such kind of flowers, they should have well exposed stamen, then only pollination by wind will take place. And also the flowers should have large feathery stigma, so that they can easily trap the pollen grains which are present in the air. So these are the conditions for wind pollination to take place. Now, wind pollinating flowers, they often have single ovule in each ovary, and they have numerous flowers which are packed in an inflorescence. An example here is corn cob. Now here if you see the diagram of the corn cob, then we can see that the tassels which we see, they are the stigma and the style which can easily wave in the wind, and they can easily trap the pollen grains. So these can easily trap the pollen grains from the wind. Now wind pollination, it is quite commonly seen in case of grasses, sugarcane, bamboo, etc. So this was the mechanism that is taking place in wind pollination. In the next class, we will start with water pollination. Thank you.